Okay, Gewaltig, good morning. So we are up to Nun Zayin with Aleph, and we're up to the two dots that are 6 lines down from the top.
Looks like we're the only two people not on vacation.
That's what it looks like, yeah.
Mm.
So so yesterday what we learned was uh an interesting question that came up where someone where someone the story happened in Arda where a Yisrael and Oved Gechavim were dosh together, they were doich anovim together, and the wine belonged to a yid. And the question is, will that wine be mutter or not? And Shmuel decided to wait for around 18 months, three regalim, before he wanted to issue his psak. And the Gemara was probing why he waited so long. So the Gemara says because he was hoping to find consensus like the Tana Rab Shimon, who holds that when a goy touches wine without kavana to be menasach that wine, that it's even mutter b'shtia. So Shmuel was hoping he would find consensus to salvage the wine completely, that it could even be drank rather than just sold. And I guess he was unable to find consensus to the Tana of Reb Shimon, and therefore he had to paskin that although it's not Osir Bano, it's Osir B'Shtir. There was a story, the Hava Beiram, that took place in the city of Beiram. Now, Beiram, I think, is on the northern part of the Euphrates River. So, so the Euphrates River in Loshen Kodesh is what? There's Nar Pros and Nar Chidekel. So I think Nar Pros is the Euphrates. Now, Biram was a famous city because it was actually one of the cities where the way they used to pass on messages is they used to light torches from mountaintop to mountaintop. And that's how they were able to transmit messages, because you could see a fire lit up on the mountaintop very far away. They were approximately 20 miles apart, these posts. And Beiram was one of the cities. I guess they had a mountain there, and that was one of the stations where they lit fires, all the way back there to Yisrael, to even know when Rosh Chodesh was. Now, there was this guy, Dava Kasolik Bedikla. He was climbing up on a dekel. I guess he wanted to cut some fruit, or maybe he wanted to cut some branches. I believe it was branches that he wanted to cut off this lulav tree. And as he was climbing down, the icy luliva abade, he was climbing down with a lulav, the kanachas, and as he was coming down, noga baroisha de luliva bechamer. The tip of the lulav that he was holding inadvertently went into the wine of a yid. Shaloi bechavana. So the question is, does it become osher? So there's two factors here. A, it's shaloi bechavana, and B, it's not a direct touching with the hand of the goy, it's touching it through the lulav. So Sharia Rav said it's mutter lezavune la'ovdei gechavim, to sell, but definitely not to drink. Amru le Rav Kahana v'Ravasi l'Rav. Rav Kahana and Ravasi told Rav in protest, v'hamar hu da'amar tinik ben yoimoy hu oise yayinesa. Kavana doesn't mean anything, because you hold that even a baby, a goy that touches wine, it makes it yayinesach. And therefore, how could you be matter here? Even though it was shaloi b'kavana should be no different than a tinik ben yoimoy, and even by a tinik ben yoimoy, you say it makes yayinesach. Amar lohu. So Rav responded, Emor da amri ano b'shtia. That I say it's oisi yayinesach, that's b'shtia. However, Bahano mi Amri, I never was that machmer. A machmer for zoydai that the Rabbanan say it's yain nesach, it's osir, that's to drink, but never did I say it's osir to sell. And in this case as well, this wine that the guy touched inadvertently with his lulav, although I'm being matir only to sell it, I'm not being matir to drink it. So the first question that has to jump out at us is, what's the comparison to Tinnik ben Yoimai? Tinnik ben Yoimai that makes Yain Nesach is referring to the Tinnik himself touching the Yain with his own hand. In our case, we have another factor that makes it more huladik, and that is the guy didn't even touch it with his own hand. The guy touched it through a lulav. So that's a factor that we have to look at a little more closely. So let's look at the very first wide line in Tosfos. Hachi Garcinon, as in our Seforim as well. Bahadi de Kanachis Noga Beresha Diluliva Bechamer Shalebicham. Our girsa is that the guy didn't touch the wine himself, rather his lulav that he was holding inadvertently touched the wine of a Jew. This girsa does not make a distinction between whether or not the guy touched the yain directly or whether the guy touched the wine indirectly through a lulav. And the only issue here that would be a tzad l'kula is the fact that it was shaloi b'kavana, the guy touched the wine without intending to touch the wine. Therefore, shari b'hana, therefore it's mutabana, it's Rav Paskins. V'hachi nicha de medama lei Rav Kahana v'Ravasi l'tinik b'nyoimai. And this also makes it understandable how Rav Kahana and Ravasi were able to compare our case to a tinik b'nyoimai, because they don't recognize a distinction by the fact that it was indirect. The parach we're going to learn tomorrow. The Gemara asked if a guy is serving wine and he's taking wine using a ladle out of a big vat, the guy is touching the wine through the ladle that he's holding. So you see, the Gemara didn't consider it a factor l'kula, that the guy is not touching the wine directly. Rather, the guy is only touching the wine through his ladle. Pirish, Sheshav Hayayid min Hagigis Binatla. The guy was taking wine out of the vat with a ladle. V'naga al yidei natla, and he touched the wine, but only through the natla. V'havaloi maga oivit kechav ma'idei davar acher. That's another example of maga oivit kechavim ma'idei davar acher. Shaloi b'kavana. The asur b'shtiya, where it's asur b'shtiya, kamoi naga b'reishis d'luliva, similar to our case. So that's the first observation that Tosfos makes, is that there is no distinction between if it was negeya directly or negeya through a davar achar. The factor to consider here is only that it was shaloi b'kavon. So Tosfos, right in the center of Tosfos, asks Akasha v'kasha lefizeh. There's a problem with this. Chada, it's simply not logical, not palpable. The davar temahu loymar the cheshvinon magoy al yedei davar acher d'lehavel l'shaloi b'chavana k'moy magoy b'gufoy shaloi b'kavana le'yasser b'shtia. I can't accept that svara. How can you equate directly touching wine with indirectly touching wine? I can't accept that touching wine through an intermediary should have the same halacha as touching wine directly. And Zok Tosfos v'chol ha'halachos mechichos l'kamon d'shari af b'shtia. I'm going to show you how the Gemara later on seems to indicate that in the case where you only touch the wine through something else, it would even be mutter b'shtia at the end, not just b'hana. Midemataris l'kamon, because the Gemara that we were just quoting with the goy who took wine with a ladle, gabe pircha de natla, by the case of natla, but uvda de Rabbi Yosy, you know what the Gemara answered? Loy tricha de moirik aruki. You know how the guy served the wine? Not with a ladle. He served the wine because he turned the whole jug over, and that's how the wine flowed into the cups that he was serving. Pirish vaveloy koichai shaloi bekavana. It was his koyach that poured the wine in, but it was shaloi bekavana to do any type of avodah zara. V'loy gazer af l'shtia, and there you see that this wine were even allowed to be drank. So oibazoi, you see clearly that when it's al yidei davar achar, if he's not touching it, it's just as koichai, there's a leniency that it's even mutter b'shtia. Void kasher the heichia v'solgedaydich to Rav Kahana v'Ravasi l'osar afano. How could you say that Rav Kahana and Ravasi wanted to argue that it should even be asher bano? Hamas nisani. We're going to have a mishnah soon as well that says madadai bekana. If he measured it with a straw, the guy was measuring the level of wine. Now, feel the rabbanon yimacher. Even according to the rabbanon, it's not asher bano. You could sell it. V'avagav davahosa magal yidei davaracher. So there's a lot of kasha that Tosfos has on this girsa, and therefore, if we scroll down to the bottom of Tosfos, lekach near the Rabbeinu Tam, not our girsa, but the girsas Rab Chanana, the halachas gedolos, v'cheinim to betshuvas hagoyim. There's many different rishonim who have a different girsa in our Gemara. The legar aspiration de luliva. They're not girsa in our Gemara that it was touched indirectly. Ella noga bechamra. The guy happened to have been holding a lulav, but he touched the wine directly with his hand. So the whole shayla shaloi bekavana, and it's only there ulahachi asher Rav b'shtia. Only there did Rav ask you to drink it, and he only allowed you to sell it. Although it's shaloi bekavana, but the guy touched it begufay, and therefore Tosfos has this other girsa. So according to our years, according to Rashi years, it's a big chumrah that even if a guy touched the wine shaloi al yidei gufay, rather just a lulav touched the wine, it would still be also to drink. But Tosfos' girsa that he quotes from Chananel is that if he touched it through something else, it wouldn't be a problem. It would even be mutar b'shtia, and the Argamor is referring to a case where he touched the wine directly. Gufa up to Gemara. Amarav Tinik ben Yoimei Oisei Yaines. That was Rav Shalach. That a Tinik ben Yoimei, even a little baby goy, a shuritzel, who touches wine, it will become Yaines, even though there's no das there. Eisvei Rab Simi bar Chia l'Rav. Simi bar Chia Rakash from Rav from the following brisa. Halakeach avodim mina oivdei kechavim shemolu v'leitav. So someone buys an evet from a goy. It's a regular goy. They made mila but not filo, so they didn't complete the process of making this goy into a yid. Albeit a yid doesn't have all mitzvahs, he has the mitzvahs of a woman. So he's gonna have halachas of someone who's not Jewish. V'chein b'nei hashvachos. The exact same halacha that we're going to tell you applies to buying a goy as an eved will even apply to a goy that was born to one of your shivchos. So this is already a goy born into a quote-unquote Jewish family, because a shivcha kanainis has all the halachas of a Jewish woman. Now, this shivcha was not a regular shivcha, because Rashi tells us this shivcha didn't toivel yet. So although she's within your family structure, she's working for you, but she hasn't completed her gerus process yet. And then she had children, and these children were malu v'loitav. The Baal, she never completed her gerus process when these children were born, so these children would have to go through their own gerus process, and therefore they would do mila and tefillah. And these kids did mila, they didn't do tefillah. Similar to the goyim that you bought from goyim that didn't finish the process yet. So they have a status of a goy, and therefore roikon umedrasan, even bishuk is tummy. We know that the Rabbanim were geyser on the saliva of a goy or anything the goy stands on, that they should be tummy just as if this person was a zav. All goyim have the status midrabanan as a zav. Now the lashon bishuk tummy would raise an eyebrow. What's the difference where it is? So Rashi says that we know that there's a rule sofik tummy b'shus harabim sveikai tar. So the Bryce is saying is, even if it was in the shuk, it's tamei, because we're not being metama these goyim, because there's a suffix that they're goyim, and therefore you would say that suffix tumah b'shus harabim is fake tar. Rather, this is a vaday tum. Vaday the rabbanon were metama a goy, even if he was molvaloy toval, he has all of the xeris that the rabbanon put on him that roikon umedras on our tummy. But for Amri La Tahar, there are those who argue, and say that the Rabbanan were not Geyser Tumah on these half-baked Jews, only on completely Goyim. And Rashi explains, why wouldn't they make the Gzera on these half-baked teretzes? Because the Rabbanan are only Geyser for mainstream scenarios. It's a very unusual scenario for someone to be for an extended period of time in this twilight zone where it's Molvay Tovel. They usually do them together. So since this scenario is an unlikely scenario, the Rabbanan were in Geyser Tumah in this unlikely scenario. So that is the halacha l'gabe Tumah. But the Brisa now addresses what is their status l'gabe making yayin nesach. Zok the Brisa weiter, yenon the wine. Gidolim, if these goyim, these avodim are adults, oisin yayin nesach. Only then do they make yayin nesach. But ketanim, if they're children, they don't have das, ein oisin yayin nesach. So you could already see what the problem is. Rav said, Tinuk ben Yoimoy makes yayin nesach. Yet this brisa says, ketanim don't make yayin nesach. So this brisa is seemingly a contradiction to Rav. The Elohen, the brisa continues. The Elohen gidolim, the Elohen ketanim. How do you define the gadol, which makes yayin nesach? And how do you find a katan that doesn't make yayin nesach? Zok the brisa, gidolim yoidin v'tiv avodas kechavim umisham shah. A guy, an adult, who will make yayin nesach, understands Avoda Zara, might be that might have it's her Avoda Zara. He's exposed to it. He understands its value or lack thereof. But ketanim, a little child, einam yoidim v'tiv avodas kechavim umisham shah. A child is not sophisticated enough to appreciate its value or its perceived value, and that you have to serve it, and therefore his innocence creates a scenario where he will not make yayin. Now it's interesting to point out that our chiyuv of mitzvahs comes at 13, even though look at certain halachas and mominus, we can identify a child that's of a mature mind even before he's 13. Some of these children shvuos and shvuos, and their transactions are valid because we assess that these children are smart enough and perceptive enough and sophisticated enough and matured enough to understand what these things are. But for mitzvahs, we have a halacha l'Moshe Messinai that tells us that only at 13. Now we know a guy who violates one of his mitzvahs, one of the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach, is chayiv misa, even without hasra. At what point does a guy become an adult to have this chiyuv? So the Mefarshim tell us it's not at 13. 13 is a number that's reserved exclusively for Eden. They would be mechuyev misa the moment they're mature enough and we see that they have an awareness and understand what they're doing. So therefore, the moment they come of age, they'll be chayiv misa for an avera that a yid would be potter for, because a yid has an exemption until he's 13. Anyway, that was just an aside. Katani miyas. Let's take a closer look at this brisa that we just quoted. Gedolim in ketanim loy. That's a direct contradiction to what Rav said, because Rav said even tinik ben yoimai who I say yayinas. Zok the Gemara, no, it's not fair. Tirgama abnei shvachos. This rule, where the brisa says that adult avodim make adult avodim have this halacha, but not the adult avodim make yayin nesach, but not ketanim. That's not referring to a guy that you buy on the market. It's referring to only the case of bnei shvachos. Only by bnei shvachos, there even Rav would be moida, since these children are raised in a Jewish household, they are born into a Jewish household, because the shivcha lives in the Jewish household. Therefore, their ketanim will not make yayin nesach. But if you buy a regular goy, even a cotton will make yayin nesach, like Rav said. Frank Gemara, how could you tell me that the halacha of yayin nesach doesn't apply to avodim that you bought? It only applies to bnei hashvachos havechein kamar. Let's look at the beginning of the brisa. Halakech avodim and oivdik achavim shemolav l'tavu v'chein bnei hashvachos shemolav l'tavu. So the entire brisa seems to say that they parallel each other. They share the same halacha l'gabei tumah, and they share the same halacha l'gabe yayin nesach. Now you want to say that they don't share the halacha l'gabe yayin nesach? Maybe haroikon umedrasa. Maybe when the Brisa expressed the chen b'nei shvachis that they have the same halacha as the regular avodim that were purchased, that's only going on the first halacha that the Brisa shares with us, that they're roik and their medrash is tamei. So the chen b'nei shvachis not only is the roik and the medrash of a guy that you bought from the shuk tamei, so too the roik and the medrash of b'nei shvachis will also be tamei. But when the Brisa continues to discuss yayin nesach, that's a halacha that's exclusively for the bnei shvachis that doesn't apply to lekeach avodim mina avdei kacham. Zogt Gemara, that distinction would make sense. If in fact that roikon umidrash nar tamei, I understand why the Brisa said v'chein bnei shvachis, because the logic would dictate that the goy that you bought from the shuk should be more chamer, should be worse than the bnei shvachis. So we know the Brisa tells us that the roikon and midrashon of a goyish eved is tamei till they're toivel. We need the Brisa to also the chen b'nei shvachos, even b'nei shvachos, which you might say are less goyish than the avodim that you bought from the shuk, but even they have tumas roikon and tumas midrashon. Elamanda martar, the Brisa quotes the Amri Latar. So we're saying there's a nusach to read in our Brisa that roikon and midrashon are tar. If roikon and midrashon are tar by the avodim that you bought, kol shekain they're tar by the bnei shvachos. So I don't need a Brisa to say the chen bnei shvachos only referencing roikon and midrashon to tell us that it's tar. Because if I know it's tar by the regular eved that you buy, surely it would be tar by the bnei shvachos. So Michael Meimar. So it's impossible to say that the chen bnei shvachos is referring to roikon and midrashon. It must be referring to yayin nesach. If it's referring to yayin nesach, in what way does the Brisa mean to say that l'gabe yayin nesach b'nei shvachos are similar to regular avodim that you buy? It must be that it must be to tell us that side by b'nei shvachos, side by avodim that you buy, ketanim don't make it yayin nesach, and now it's true Shran Rav. Dr. Mura, no, that's not the prat in which we're comparing b'nei shvachos to regular avodim to. Rather, hakam ashvalon avodim dumyud de b'nei shvachos. Yes, there's a similarity between avodim and b'nei shvachos, but not what you're suggesting that by b'nei shvachos and by avodim that a cotton can make yayin nesach. Because in fact, the cotton could make yayin nesach. So what is the similarity? As follows: Ma b'nei shvachos molu v'loy tavlu hu de'osin yayin nesach. Only if they didn't complete their gerus process, there they make yayin nesach. But if they were molu v'tavlu, if they completed the gerus process, loy, they would not make yayin nesach. Af avodim came, so avodim, once they fulfill and complete the gerus process, they had mila and tefillah, they will not make yayin nesach. You might tell me, what's the chiddush? That's a regular Jew. There's a very big chiddush involved because there's somebody who actually argued on this. La fukim midir Rav Nachman Amar Shmuel. Rav Nachman Amar Shmuel, halakeach avodim min oivdei kechavim. They still make yayin nesach. They're regular Jews, yet they still make yayin nesach. Why? Or until when? Until enough time elapses that they no longer think and talk about Avodah Zara. A guy is odok in Avodah Zara. He's saturated with thoughts of Avodah Zara. Once he joins the Jewish fold, it's going to take some time, but eventually he's no longer going to make yayin nesach. Kamash malon delay. Our Brisa is telling you v'chein b'nei shvachos have the same halacha as an eved that you buy. The moment it's molav v'tovlu, this guy, this eved now will no longer make yayin nesach. Now you might ask me a question: if you're telling me that just becoming Jewish doesn't make you immune to a yayin nesach, so every normal ger that was molav v'tovlu should still make yayin nesach for at least the amount of time. Why is it that nowadays we treat a ger a fresh ger like a regular Jew. So for that, the achroidim are mechalak. A regular ger didn't wake up one day, boom, I'm a ger. There's long preparation. So during that long preparation period, the ger or the goy is removing himself from the Avodah Zara. Ideologically, he obviously recognized that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the true Bayer Olam, and that's why he wanted to become a ger in the first place. But an Eved, in the spur of the moment, he's waiting there in a slave market like any other guy. You buy him, you mal and tovel him, and he's instantly going to change his deis. So this dafka applies to an Eved or a Ben Shivcha. It does not apply to a regular ger who wanted to be Megayer. Okay, beautiful. Goof effect Gemara. Now that you raised this new shita, that even though a Eved is technically a Jew because he had Mila and Fila, he still makes Yain Esach. Let's analyze that. Goof Amar Rab Nachman and Shmuel Alakech Avodim and Oivik Kachavim Avavisha Malav Tovlu Oisin Yain Esach when Ache Tishka Avodim Chami Pim. The Chama. How long does it take for a guy to forget about his getchkes? Amar Rab Shmuel Levi Achneim Osar Chaydesh. It takes 12 months. So after the Eved is purchased and there's Mila and Fila done, then the clock starts ticking. For 12 months, this Eved will still make Yain Esach. Eifri Rabba Rab Nachman. So Frank Rabba Akasha to Rab Nachman from the exact same brisa that we just learned to try to challenge Rav with. And this is what the brisa says. Halakech Avodim and Oivik Kachavim Shemalu v'lo tovlu v'chein b'nei hashvachos Shemalu v'lo tovlu Reikan u'madrason b'shuk turning over on Tamid Beis. Even b'shuk, as Rashi told us, because this is a valley, not a safek, is tamei. V'amrila tahar. And there are those who say in the brisa that it's tar, there is no tumas reik or tumas medris on a eved that was malu v'laytav. Yenon, what's the status of their wine? Gedolim oishin yayin nesach ketanim ein oishin yayin nesach. Elohin gedolim ve'elohin ketanim. The brisa continues. How do you define a gadol? How do you define a katan? Gedolim sheyodim b'tiv avodas kechavim u'misham sheh. Ketanim she'en yodim b'tiv avodas kechavim u'misham sheh. Exactly like we learned just a moment ago. Katanim yos. Let's drill down and extract some information from this brisa. Malu v'laytavlu in. What type of eved, what type of ben shivcha would cause yayin to become yayin nesach if there was no tefillah yet? But malu v'tavlu, if the process of gerus was complete, there was both mila and tefillah, lie. The moment they're malu v'tavlu, our brisa indicates they no longer make yayin nesach. That's Shver on Shmuel, who says that the eved continued to make yayin nesach for another year. Dr. Gemara, Tirgama. How is Shmuel Amar Rab Nachman going to forever this brisa, which seems to say that the moment it's Molav Tavlu, it doesn't. This Eved no longer makes Yain Nesach. Tirgama Abnei Shvachais. He'll also make a distinction. He'll say the halacha that Molav Tavlu instantly makes you into a yid and you no longer make Yain Nesach. That only applies to Bnei Shvachais. So we're taking the same strategy that Rav took before. We're saying that this halacha that we say applies to Bnei Shvachos doesn't necessarily apply to Avodim as well. For the Gemara, how could you say that? The same kasha that we asked before. Havachein katan. V'chein means that the halachas of Bnei Shvachos mirror the halachas of the Avodim. Dr. Gemara, no. Maybe Aroikan u'medrasa. Maybe they only share the same halacha l'gabi roik and medris, but maybe they don't share the same halachas l'gabi yayin nesach. Zok Gemara, the same kasha as before. Hanich l'mandam or tamei. There's a chiddush in saying v'chein that tumas roik and medris also applies to bnei shvachos. But if you hold that the Rabbanan were not tamei the roik and medris of an eved that was malav l'tavlu, so then kol shekain by bnei shvachos. So I don't need the v'chein for that. So I'm back to square one. Michael Meimar. The only option we have is this halacha that the chiddush is that just like bnei shvachos, malu v'tavlu immediately is no longer going to make yain nesach. So too by avodim. No, that's not the similarity. Hakamash, you know what the similarity is? Avodim dumio de bnei shvachos, ma bnei shvachos kedolim u'da oisin yain nesach, ketanim ein oisin yain nesach, af avodim nami, gedolim oisin yain nesach, ketanim ein oisin yain nesach. Afukim in the Rav, the Amarav, Tinik ben Yoimei Oisei Ainesach, the Mashmal on the Lord. So Tosfos points out that this now creates a very interesting scenario. Because if I asked you a question, is the halach of Rav that Tinik ben Yoimei Oisei Ainesach, does it have any connection or interdependency with the halach of Shmuel Amar Rab Nachman that a Eved up to a year makes Yain Nesach? They're two completely different issues that would have two completely different svaras. And you would say they're not mutually exclusive. But when you learn our Sugya of the Gemara, depending on which way you learn, it would automatically exclude the other way. Because if you want to learn, like on Amar Beis, where the Gemara says, Shmuel Amar Rab Nachman, I believe it's Shmuel Amar Rab Nachman, it's Shmuel Amar Rab Nachman to Rab Nachman Amar Shmuel, I'm sorry. So if you're going to learn like Shmuel, you'll be forced to say that the Brisa is going Keneged Rav and telling us that a Tinik bin Yoimoi does not make Yain Nesach. And if you're going to learn like Rav that a Tinik bin Yoimoi is Yain Nesach, then the V'chein of the Brisa is going to have to tell you that by Malu V'Tovlu, right away, it no longer makes Yain Nesach. So because of this Brisa, it makes these two halachas be connected, and you either hold like Shmuel or you hold like Rav, but you can't hold like both. So therefore, if we know, for instance, that we for sure pascha like Shmuel, that the moment an Eved is Malu V'Tovlu, he is no longer going to make Yain Nesach, then by definition, you're also going to have to hold that Tinik ben Yoimoi does not make Yain Nesach. And that has a huge impact in halacha, as we'll see from this fascinating Tosfos. We think that there was no politics, there was no hot politics and heated discussions in the olden days, but we'll see there very much was. So let's have a quick look at this big Tosfos, La Fuke Midarav, the Amar Tinik ben Yoimoi. Zokt Tosfos. If you look at the Maskana here, Hashta Chazina, the Lahai Lishna the Amri La Tar, according to the Lashon who holds that they were not Geyser Tumas Roik and Tumas Reders on Avodim that have Mila V'Loi Tfilah, will be forced to learn that Shmuel Lesle the Rav, the Amar Tinik ben Yoimoi, is going to make Yain Nesach. Shmuel can't hold like Rav because he has to learn the V'chein to tell you that the Shivcha the Ben Shivcha has the same lach as the Eved, where a Tinik ben Yoimoi would not make Yain Nesach. The only way for Shmuel to explain this brisa is if he argues on Rav. The Tinik ben Yoimoi einay oisa Yain Nesach, and therefore umuter af b'shasiyah. A little child that touches wine, if it's a little shuditzel that touches a wine, and either an udal or the udala will not make the wine usher. You'd still be allowed to drink. Any young child, even though Rav says Tinik ben Yoimoi, only a Tinik ben Yoimoi, but Avoda means Tinik ben Yoimoi means any child who's not mature and sophisticated enough to understand what Avodah Zarah is. Avodim gedolim avabi shemol v'tavlu, but avodim gedolim v'ramol v'tavlu, like Shmuel says, shrichen lahamtim yud beis chodesh lashkia shem avodah kechav mipia. There, they still would make Yain Nesach even after they finish the Gerish process until a year goes by and they're no longer always thinking on the Avodah Zarah. And based on this, upasku halachas gedolos, the halachas gedolos paskin, the loy kirav b'tinik ben yoimai, which is a very big kula for us, because a goyish child that touches wine will be no problem at all, the way we're approaching this. Rab Chanano, nami pasak Shmuel, the ba'inon shikua of 12 months. So Shmuel's halachas a chumrah, but there, it's linked to now you'll be makel by Rab's halach. So once upon a time, Motzari Kosov, the Re found a record, notes that the Talmidim of Rabbeinu Tam wrote about the limud, about the Piskei Halacha that they received from Rabbeinu Tam. So they found these notes that were from the Loimdim Lefnei Rabbeinu Tam, from the Talmidim of Rabbeinu Tam, Sheposak, they recorded that Rabbeinu Tam Paskin, the halacha of Shmuel. Rabbeinu Tam also passes like Shmuel. Hoil v'sover Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi Kavosei. The Baal Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi holds like Shmuel, as we saw in Amar Aleph. And we know the halacha Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi legabe Rabbi Yochanan. We know we pass like Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi over Rabbi Yochanan, and therefore, by definition, the koshken legabe Rav and Shmuel. And surely we will pass like Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, even though he might contradict the psak of Rav or Shmuel. Here he's with Shmuel, he's just contradicting Rav's psak. Because we know whenever Rav and Shmuel would say something, we would default to Rabbi Yochanan, and therefore we pass like Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, because Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi trumps Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Yochanan trumps Rav and Shmuel. Then we for sure pass like Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi to side with Shmuel, and therefore Tidik ben Yoimai will not make Yain Esek. As an aside, we actually had a very good example of where you see that Rabbi Yochanan trumps Rav and Shmuel, because if you remember, there was a question a couple of lot ago at the bottom of Amud Beis. Ula was leaning against a demos, and he was told, how could you lean against the demos? Rav and Shmuel said that it's Asur Bahana, even though it's cracked, because the guy wouldn't reject it. And you know what Ula answered? You're right, Rav and Shmuel says that it's Asur. But Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish say it's mutter. So you see clearly Ula was saying, I could rely on Rabbi Yochanan to be matter, to have enough from this demos, even though Rav and Shmuel said you cannot. V'gam b'seider tanoim v'amiroyim tzivis yad Rav HaGadol Rabbi Yosef Toiv Alam. There was a great man whose name was Rabbi Yosef Toiv Alam, and in his writings he recorded halacha k'moisei b'chol makom, and he also paskened like Rav, and because he said the halacha is like Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. The Gam Rabbeinu Tam may be harbi rayis also. Rabbeinu Tam brought many rayis, and the kulam niru is what the Gershon changed. They were all legit. So we have rayis that we do not pasken like Rav. We hold that Tidik ben Yoimai will not make Yain Esek. And we're going to see what a huge impact this will have in just a moment. V'oid pasuk Rabbeinu Tam kelishna d'amar roikon umedrason b'shuk tar the bishal soifrim holach achar amekel. We go by Amekel. Uluvi oisei aloshin according to the loshin that roikon and medrason are tar. Polak Shmuel adarav. Shmuel would have to argue with Rav because he's going to have to learn the brisa to argue with Rav. B'tinik b'nyoim. Now here where it gets very, very exciting. The Oid Pirshu Rashbam Varivam, all of the titans of Torah, and you know who they said this in the name of? B'Shem Rashi. So now we're bringing Rashi involved, and we're connecting him to an off-the-charts kula. Shekasav v'tshuvas hagoyim. Ki bizman hazeh nowadays ein iser hana b'maga ovet kechavim b'yayin. There's no such thing as an iser hana nowadays when a guy touches wine. Now that's definitely not how we fear Zach. But they were saying in the times of the Rishonim that there's no iser of yayin nesach to asur yayin b'ana if a guy touches it. Why is that? Today's goyim don't take avodah zara seriously. They don't make nisuch anymore, and therefore the cheshuvin ke'ein yoidin b'tiv avodah kachavim u'shamshel. They're just like a young baby who doesn't appreciate what avodah zara is, and we know Shmuel holds in this case that it does not make yain esach. And Rav holds it's aser, but Shmuel holds it's mutter, and as we just listed, we paskin like Shmuel over here. And therefore, if a guy owes you money and he doesn't have the money to pay, and he wants to pay you with wine that he has, so they went to ask Rashi, can I take this wine? Can I accept this wine as payment for an overdue chayv? And Rashi said, wine? Why not? And he said, you're allowed to take the wine because there's no problem of yain nesach anymore. Like Abi Yisrael.
First of all, he was in the wine business, Rashi, right?
So he would really want to paskin no.
Yeah.
He wants to buy my wine. Don't
right. But maybe it was his wine in the first place. Second of all, so this is a huge chiddush. So Rashi must hold that Christianity is not avodas kochavim.
Well, our fund is going to be over in a flash.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
The Re freaked out and he sent the Rabbeinu Tam a letter that this cannot be true at all because based on what you're saying, Tachazi, come and see the minoch from you, Rabbeinu Tam, ume'avua de imach, and from your grandfather Rashi, ume'achuch, because of you guys, mystery maga oivit kechavim biyayin la'alma afilu b'shtia. You are now causing a tremendous kilkel because you're going to totally blow away the whole concept of yayin nesach, and you're even going to allow people to drink wine that was touched by a guy. Why? Because the other Shmuel pasuk b'shem avicha Rabbeinu Shloima, because your brother, the Rashbam, is paskening in the name of the mother of your father, Rashi. So now you're taking a psak and you're blaming it on Rashi, and you're saying the Yoivnik Achavim Bizman is Einam Chashuvim El Ktinik Ben Yoimai, V'at the Poisik B'Tinik Ben Yoimik Shmuel, and Shmuel holds the Islay the Eino Isiyai Nezek Lesser Af Bishtia, and Shmuel holds you even allowed to drink that wine. So basically, what you've just done is you're pinning on Rashi the total elimination of the prohibition of Yain Nesach. How dare you do that? The Heishav Rabbeinu Tam, and Rabbeinu Tam answered, Ki Talmud Shekas of Nivel Hoya, live site. That letter that we quoted earlier, where the Talmidim of Rabbeinu Tam quoted him as saying that a Tinnik Ben Yoimai will not answer wine, that Talmud made a mistake. He was Niva Livsoik. He was rushing to Paskin and he didn't thoroughly analyze this. V'chas v'shalom, shaloi Allah aliboy. For sure, Rabbi Tam says, I was never allowed such a thing. Elavada kaimel kolon kerav b'yisurei lagabi shmuel. When it comes to Hilchos Isaveter, we pass it like Rav, and even though there's no kavana, v'tinik b'nyoymei oise yayin esach lesser b'shtia. And v'oidik achavim b'zman hazeh vaday heim ketinik b'nyoymei. I agree they're like a tinik b'nyoymei kipsak Rabbeinu Shloima, like Rashi says, but it doesn't matter because even the tinik b'nyoymei we pass like Rav that his wine is a yayin esach. We don't pass like Shmuel when it comes to Lahachak Yud Beis Chodesh L'Shtakeya, the Brisa Mafke Minei L'Lishan Avatar, because since we pass like Rabbi Isri, then it automatically excludes that we don't pass like Shmuel. So Rashi Rabbeinu Tam says it's all a mistake, and Avoda it's usher. So v'chazer Rabbeinu Tam v'amar devadai mitoich halachos le'motzinu raya pshuta lahatir maga oivit kechavim. We cannot be matered b'yayin. V'af lo istam yeinam b'ana. It's even going to be usher b'ana. Kiyim l'moichrei la'oiser oivit kechav matzamai. We'll see later on. There's a term to sell to the guy who touched it himself. But whatever the case is, this was a big controversy. Because there was a group of people who were basically saying there's no such thing as Yain Nesach anymore, when in fact there surely was. Now let's just quickly learn a couple of lines to finish the Amud. Hahu Uvda, there was a story, David ben Mechuza, that happened in Mechuza. Also, a guy came, and Ayel Lechanusa de Yisrael, he came into a Jewish store. Amalu, he told him in the store had a big vat of wine there, and many other things in this general store. And the guy asked the Yid, the customer, do you have any wine to sell? And the Yid said, no, I don't have any wine, even though there's a vat of wine sitting right there. But have a Yosef Chamer B'Davla. There was wine right there in a vat. And the guy saw it, so he got angry. Well, you don't sell me wine? He put his hand into the wine, he shook it around. Is this not wine? Because he was frustrated that the Yid said he didn't have wine to sell. Now the Yid got really upset. You're sticking your fingers into my wine. You're making it usher. So he grabbed it. The store owner was frustrated and upset that this guy stuck his hand into the wine. Shadya, he took it, the vat that he had that was on display. The Shadya Lidana. And he dumped that wine that became usher because the guy touched it into his big barrel. Now the question is, did he just answer his entire big barrel from Yain Nesek? So Zok the Gemara, Sharya Rava Lizvune La'oivdei Kichav. Rava held that you could sell it to a guy because this guy had no intention of Nisach. He was just trying to show that there was wine there, and that wouldn't answer it. Bahana, you'd be allowed to sell it. If there was a big tumult. Rav Huna bar Chinna and Rav Huna bar Rav Nachman held it would be Osir. It's Yain Nesek. It's Osir. Now they weren't in the same city as Rav, where they could have had a meeting and discussed it and hashed it out. But they were in a different city and they objected to this halach. So Novak Shipurei de Rava Visharu, they announced with Pachkevilin and an announcement in Shul that Rava holds this wine is allowed. But the Novki Shipurei de Rav Huna bar Chinna, Rav Huna bar Rav Nachman, the Osri. So you can only imagine what type of tumult was going on. Rava put out a Gilul Das that this wine is mutter to sell, and these other Chachamim put out a Kol Koyer that this wine is osir. We can only imagine the tumult that happened. And we're in the middle of a heated story. What happened with Rava and Rafuna? What happened with them? We will see Bez Hashem tomorrow. Everyone should have a good bench today.